The Western world grew rich because of slavery, imperialism, and colonial wealth extraction. Right? Wrong. This is a common misconception, which I'm rebutting in my new book, Imperial Measurement, a cost-benefit analysis of Western imperialism. Let's start with the basics. Where does wealth come from? Why are some countries rich while others are poor? Why did the Industrial Revolution start in Northwestern Europe and the Western world rather than somewhere else or in several places simultaneously? Most economists would argue that rich countries are rich because they have good institutions and good economic policies. That is admittedly not much of an answer. Economists disagree with each other on what exactly good institutions are and on what exactly good economic policies are. They disagree with each other on the best way to get them. But at least on this very general level, they would agree with each other. In recent years, though, we have seen a revival of a competing theory. A few years ago, a crowd of Black Lives Matter protesters in Bristol toppled a statue of Edward Colston, a 17th century merchant who had made a fortune in the slave trade. When they were asked why they were doing this, one of the organizers said that they wanted to highlight the fact that, and I quote, "so much of the prosperity enjoyed today in the UK comes off the back of historical atrocities." End of quote. You can find hundreds of articles in papers like The Guardian making similar arguments. Where do they get this idea from? In the 1940s, the historian Eric Williams, who would later become the first post-independence Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, wrote an influential book with the title Capitalism and Slavery. He argued that the profits from the slave trade and from the colonial slave labour plantations were reinvested into the British economy and helped finance the Industrial Revolution. This became known as the Williams thesis. Now, Williams never said that this was the only reason why Britain industrialized, and he did not say that the Industrial Revolution could not have happened otherwise. He said that profits from slavery were one major factor among several. But as is often the case, when the idea later got popularized, it got inflated and generalized and blown out of proportion. It was first turned into slavery made Britain rich, and then into the Western world as a whole is built on little else but imperialist exploitation. It's easy to see why this idea has become so fashionable again in recent years. It is a great story. It is an original sin story of modern Britain, which also doubles up as an original sin story of capitalism. It allows its proponents to flaunt their progressive credentials and their anti-capitalist credentials at the same time. But is this story actually true? It is certainly not the only interpretation. There is also a long tradition of liberal anti-imperialism. Liberal thinkers in the 19th century, such as the free trade campaigner Richard Cobden, and liberal thinkers in the 18th century, such as the father of economics, Adam Smith, they thought that imperialism was not just morally wrong, but that it was also quite simply bad economics. They said that the cost of conquest, the cost of occupation, and the cost of colonial administration was simply not worth the benefits. The benefits, they said, were modest anyway, because you do not need to colonize other countries in order to trade with them. You can just have an open trade policy between sovereign nations. So who's right? Did colonial empires make economic sense? Did colonial empires make a major contribution to the development of Britain and the Western world? Or would the West have been better off without them? There are huge gaps in the historic data, so I cannot come up with one single definitive number in the book, but I can narrow it down quite considerably. The short summary is that there is much better evidence for the liberal anti-imperialist view than there is for the fashionable Guardian/BLM view. If there were any gains from imperialism at all, they were simply not nearly big enough to make more than a minor contribution to the industrial development of Britain and the West. It is quite possible that there were no net gains at all. It is quite possible that most colonial empires were net loss makers. To find out more, visit iea.org.uk and download a copy of my book.